So, before we get started into this week's topic, let's talk about the news. Really, two pieces of news for Android developers. Firstly, Google Play Services has launched. We're really excited about this. It now provides the OAuth identity management, or OAuth. It provides you OAuth tokens so that you can use a single nice API that abstracts the whole OAuth side of things for you across all of our Google services. We also have the Google Plus SDK as part of that. So Google Play Services is quite interesting because what it is it's a component that's actually going to be there on users' devices. So as part of the Google Play Store, the Google Play Services component will be installed, and now as developers you can just go ahead and start using that new API. This is just the start of something much bigger. Google Play Services will grow, and OAuth 2 and Google Plus are finally here. So that's really good. And the other thing that I'm really excited about this is that we have a new build system coming for the Android developer tools. Our team, Xavier Durocher, has put up a document that sort of describes some of the changes that are coming up. They're not available in a stable release yet, but you can certainly go and have a look at that document and see what kind of changes are coming. Yeah, this is good stuff. More tools for developers is always a good thing. All right, so it's tablet week, so our focus today is to really use the word tablet as much as possible. No, that's not true. We want to basically empower developers to build apps that work well on phones and tablets. So we're actually going to have a series of presentations on ADL Plus over the coming weeks. Today's the first one, and it's really about the fundamental building blocks of these apps, and it's really fragments. Those are the components that you use. So today is very much a primer on fragments, and so we're going to cover a few things. But before we do, let's talk about some fundamental goals that developers would like to have, or we always want to have, when we build phone and tablet apps. Firstly, we want to have a single app for multiple, right? We don't want to have to manage a different set of code for a phone version, for a tablet version, or even for a Google TV version. As much as possible, we want to maximize our code reuse. And in doing so, you kind of want to have your code, be quite decoupled, so that you can build these reusable components and have them not totally depend on the other components being there. Decoupling is obviously a really good thing in general software design. And finally, you want to build these apps such that they're backward compatible. Android 3.0 is where, or Honeycomb, is where we first introduced tablets. And prior to that, we had Gingerbread and Froyo. Now, Gingerbread is still a very popular version of the platform. So when we talk about these fragments and utilizing them, we want to do it in a way that still allows our apps to run on these older versions. So we're going to touch on that too. How do we make sure that they're backward compatible whilst keeping all of these goals in mind? So what are fragments? Well, fragments, they're really reusable components. So it's about grouping bits of your UI or other common functionality so that you can then use it in these standalone classes. So when we think about taking an app and making it available on tablets, what we want to do is really promote the idea of the fact that you should really rethink your UI. Don't just take your phone layout and stretch it, because that's not really a good experience. And in the majority of cases, stretching out a typical list or something like that on a phone and just stretching it out onto a tablet doesn't really result in a good user experience, and users never tend to appreciate that. So as you can see from this diagram here, where you might have had two activities, 1 and 2, what you would do is actually take the contents of those activities and put them into fragments. Then on the phone, you would be showing one fragment at a time, whereas on the tablet, you could show both fragments at a time within a single activity. So the activity is still that outer window, and you can see it based on the blue border. You still have activities when you're running on phones and tablets, and we're not moving away from activities. But we're taking out all of that code that we had within the activity around the user interface and just regrouping it into fragments. So what are fragments? Well, fragments are basically reusable UI components. By grouping our contents that we would have had in an activity, it means that we can be flexible with these fragments. So, you know, being a fragment isn't just like an include in your layout. There's actually more to it than that. It actually participates as part of the life cycle. So fragments actually have a life cycle, and they're attached to an activity. And that's really important because the activity will initialize them at key points, it'll populate them, and there are some specific overloads that you should be aware of. Fragments can also maintain their own backstack. So in in a typical phone app, you might go from one activity to the next to the next. But if you now start reusing the contents of those activities into fragments, you might use a single activity and just transition from one fragment to the next. Now, when the user hits the back button, you don't want it to go from one activity to the previous one. You want to make sure you navigate backwards through the fragment stack before you go to the previous activity. So fragments allow this. The other thing to keep in mind is that fragments don't have to be UI components. They can just be background workers that you instantiate and that participate as part of the life cycle. So we have an API called findFragmentByTag. So typically what you'd have is you'd have a fragment that you'd put in a layout, and you'd do a find view by ID and grab the layout and so on and so forth. But you can actually instantiate fragments, and using the fragment manager, you can basically name them or tag them. So this findFragmentByTag is a way to basically get a hold of that fragment at runtime without having to rely on things like the view hierarchy. So let's talk a little bit about fragments and activities in general. So fragments, the user interface part is optional. Typically, in most circumstances, you would use them with a user interface. They're really for grouping. You would use them for grouping UI, but you don't have to. Whereas with an activity, it always has a user interface, right? It's always the part that the user sees. Both of them tend to have lifecycle methods, and in fact, the fragment tends to have a few more lifecycle methods than the activity in the typical sort of UI style fragment. Fragments can't be standalone. They are attached to activities, right? And we actually have an override called onAttach and onDetach. Now, the other thing you should be aware of is the use of intents. So typically we use intents to invoke certain pieces of functionality in your activity. That still holds true, except with fragments, intents don't fire up fragments directly. You have to go through an activity. And we're going to clarify this later. So what we're doing here is first describing what fragments are. We're going to look at now the advantages of using fragments, and then eventually we will talk about before we talk about backwards support, we're going to talk about communication as well between fragments. So let's look at a typical layout. On a phone, this is the People app that we've had since Ice Cream Sandwich. And you'll see on the left-hand side you've got a list view. With this list view, you have your list of contacts there, and there's some tabs across the top. You can swipe across them and so on. It's a fairly standard list view type screen. We've got some actions along the bottom. Now, if we were to click Matthias there, it would take us from the list view for that contact and go into the detail view. Now, a traditional phone app may have implemented these as activity 1 for the list view and activity 2 for the detail view. But if we then reorganize our code such that this list view part of it becomes a fragment and the detailed view also becomes a fragment, then what happens is on the phone we can still present the same interface, but when we go to something like the tablet, we can show these multiple fragments at the same time. We're maximizing our code reuse. We're not having to define layouts multiple times and even code multiple times or having really complex inheritance hierarchies. With fragments, we can basically show multiple pieces of UI at the same time. There is some extra code that you need to do to distinguish between a phone layout and a tablet layout, and we're going to look at that next. But the difference is really phenomenal in terms of the overhead for you and your developers. So when it comes to defining layouts, you might be saying, well, at what point, how can I say that this layout is going to be for a phone or for a tablet? Well, in Eclipse, when you define your resource or your layout directories, you can basically you can say it's a layout directory, which will be the default layout that gets used, or you can have these extra qualifiers. So one of the qualifiers is something that we call smallest width, and then you can specify a number and a DP. Now, smallest width basically says that regardless of whether I'm holding it in portrait or landscape view, what is the smallest dimension on this device? Now, what we've done is that we've got some metrics in there that tell you that this is the range of values that will result in a tablet UI or a phone UI. So if you specify smallest width, 600, anything that has 600 DPs or greater is considered a tablet. Okay? We've in fact added an extra layer of differentiation there. If you specify 600 DP, it'll get picked up by 7-inch tablets. If you specify 720 DP, it'll actually get picked up by 10-inch tablets. So you may want to have a different layout between your 7-inch tablets and your 10-inch tablets. And this metric here is how you do that. And then you'd still have a normal layout folder. And that normal layout folder is what will get picked up for phones, the 600 DP for 7-inch tablets, and the 720 DP for 10-inch tablets. You don't have to have all three. There's nothing that sort of forces you to do so. But our recommendation is at least have two. Have the default layout folder, and then have the 600 DP for your tablet UI. Now, prior to Android 3.2, so really only Android 3.0 and 3.1, the only way that you could have a tablet layout was to specify a res large or a res, that should say layout large and layout extra large directory. In fact, I'm going to just fix that live right now because I can. And we're done. So it's a layout large and a layout extra large directory because prior to Android 3.2 we didn't have that smallest width qualifier. So a large or an extra large layout would actually get picked up by those devices. We no longer recommend that you use large and extra large qualifiers because it becomes a little bit of a gray area. You know, what defines a large screen? Is it a 7-inch tablet like the Nexus 7, or is something like a Galaxy Note considered a large screen? So rather than having these generic buckets, we now use the smallest width qualifier, and you should too. So at runtime, how would you tell between whether you're running in a phone layout or a tablet layout? Well, it's easy, right? Because in your activity, you're going to have a layout that you load, and on the phone, you would typically only be showing one fragment at a time. Right? On a tablet, you might show more than one fragment at a time. So what you can do is use the Find View by ID API and see if you can find both fragments, for example. And if you're only able to find one fragment, then you know that you're running on a phone. Right? If you're able to find both fragments, then you know that you're running in a tablet. And so that's that extra sort of glue code that I was talking to. But it really belongs in your activity because remember, fragments themselves should be standalone, reusable components that are fairly decoupled from everything else. It's the activity that kind of binds the multiple fragments, or really your layout that binds those multiple fragments together. So you can just use a trick like that with using Find View by ID and doing a null check, and that should sort you out. So, we talked about intents before. Typically what happens is when an intent gets fired off, your activity gets invoked and said, hey, gets told, here's an intent. But you can't go from an intent directly to a fragment. It still comes through to an activity. So you might be wondering, well, how do I manage that? How do I get an intent to end up invoking a fragment? And the answer is it has to go through an activity. But let me just show you some code that demonstrates how that propagation may work. So let me just highlight the relevant section. So here what's happened is where we're in the, it could happen in onCreate or it could happen on new intent. And what you do is basically do a get intent call. So this code is actually in your activity itself, right? And so we just do a get intent, we get the action, and we're just comparing whether that the intent action matches whatever action it is that we're interested in. So once we do that in our activity, we can then go, okay, I know that it is this action, so now I'm going to go and get hold of my note list fragment. So in this activity, there's probably a list fragment and a detail fragment. So a list of notes, and then the detail fragment is probably the note itself. So what we did is we got the intent. Now we managed to pull the relevant fragment out, and then finally we are able to pass in some extra information. From the intent we can get some extra information out as to which list item we want to select, or so on and so forth. But this is an example of where in the activity we received the intent, and then we followed that through and passed it through the relevant fragment. So we are kind of starting to spread out our code a little bit between different classes, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Okay, so we talked about intent communication, but what about when you've got two fragments and you want to communicate with one another? You could do all sorts of sort of trickery where you've got fragments talking to fragments, but it's generally not a good thing, because then you start to really closely couple them together. Then one fragment needs to know whether the other fragment exists and is being loaded, and so on and so forth, and then pass information back and forth. Instead, what we recommend is you still use the activity as kind of a proxy. So what you would do to achieve fragment-to-fragment communication is go via the activity. So here you'll see that what we recommend is that you define an interface in fragment 1, we're calling it interface A for now, and fragment 2 would have interface B defined. The activity would implement those methods, okay? And then when those methods are being called on those interfaces, it would then pass it on to the relevant fragment. And it may, in fact, like on a phone, it may actually need to instantiate the second fragment. Because on a phone, though, both fragments may not have been instantiated because that single fragment layout got loaded. So really the activity is that thing that's binding it all together, right? So what would happen is that once all of these, the interfaces are defined and the activity is implementing them, your fragments are invoking the activity, and then the activity in turn is calling the fragment. So let's look at some code that demonstrates that. So onAttach is within a fragment. That's an overload that says, an override that says that your fragment has been attached to a particular activity, and that's when it gets called. So when our fragment gets attached to an activity, we're just storing that activity as a callback object within the fragment itself. Okay, and you'll notice that the type of that callback object is this note list event callback. That's our interface, which is at the bottom of this this page. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, we store it as an interface, and then on our fragment in this onListItemClick method, when we need to go and do something about the fact that the user has selected something, we then can do it one of two ways. We can just call getActivity and then go call the do something method, or we can use the interface itself, which we stored as a callback object in the onAttach method. Now, my personal preference is to use the callback. I think it's cleaner, and we've defined clear interfaces. So again, we're kind of decoupling our code quite nicely. So you'd call callback.onList note clicked and pass in the ID. Now, remember we talked about at the start in this onAttach method, we stored this callback, and we said it had to implement an interface. Well, that's what this bit at the bottom is. It's the interface that this fragment is defining to say, hey, whichever object I need to sort of inform that a particular action is taken, that object will obviously implement this method itself, and I'll pass in a node ID or whatever it may be. So, communication between fragments, don't do it directly from fragment to fragment. Have a proxy layer, and that's typically the activity, because the activity is the thing that fragments are attached to. So we talked about some nice things here, but I also mentioned that fragments came into Android 3.0. The good news is that we actually introduced fragments in the support library. So the support library is a reusable library. You may have heard me mention it before. It's really simple to include in your project. Within Eclipse, you just right-click the project, go to Android Tools, and say Add Support Library. It will go and download the latest version, include the jar in your project, and set up the build path for you as well. And the namespace is then available. So we basically put backward-compatible fragments in the support library. Now, my recommendation to developers is use these support fragments from the start. Anytime you're building a new app, start with fragments. think about tablets and phones as effectively being first-class citizens. Try not to start with a phone app and then, migrate to a tablet app later. You may choose to do the tablet side of things later on, but at least set up the infrastructure and start using Fragments from the very beginning, because it's a lot easier then to manage a tablet version of your app. Whereas if you don't use Fragments and then later on you have to go and reorganize all of your activities and so on into Fragments, the overhead is a lot more later on because you've got a big chunk of code that you need to refactor. So the support library has Fragments, and one other really important piece of advice is don't mix and match support Fragments with the native Fragments that you'll find on Android 3.0 and upwards. They're different implementations, they're different classes, so you can't just mix and match a support fragment and a native fragment. But we are able to achieve backward compatibility, and that is how all of our internal apps work as well. You'll notice things like, I showed you the People app, which is obviously an ice cream sandwich app, but even things like Gmail uses multiple fragments. Anyways, so that's backward compatibility. That's a bit of a primer on Fragments. So let's move on to Q&A. Does anyone on the thread here have any questions on today's topic or even otherwise? I'm just going to go look at the thread, and doesn't look like there's been any questions posted. There's a question that says, are you going to share this presentation after this session? And the answer is yes. It's available on YouTube because the recording goes up, and it's it'll be there, so you can go and view it at any point in time. All right, so there's no questions there. My colleague Anirudh is joining us from Hyderabad. Anirudh, should we move to Google Moderator?
Yes. Thanks for the session. I'm good. So let's take up the questions in Moderator. The first one, and I'm going to read it loud. My music player app audio streaming should work while I'm driving in a car with 3G card. What are the API features should I consider as a developer? The player app works excellent with Wi-Fi and some devices with 3G. Right, Ankur, do you want to take that up?
Yeah, sure. Look, in general, there's no specific API that you want to use to differentiate your behavior, your app's behavior, but there's some strategy. So with 3G, it's not a good idea to continually have the radio on. As much as possible, you want to prefetch and chunk it up. If you can do that when you're on Wi-Fi, that's even better. But streaming and just having a constant or asking for chunks or buffers of data periodically is probably not the best way to do it, because it will have a significant drain on the user's device. So yeah, prefetching is one really good thing. Reto Meyer, our colleague, presented at Google I/O this year, and it was the talk was making good apps great. So check it out. There's some great advice in there on how to achieve some of this. But what you can do to work out whether you are connected to Wi-Fi or 3G is use the connectivity manager, and then change your behavior accordingly. And also keep in mind that if you are pulling down lots of data, and prefetch can be one of those sensitive things. Just make sure the user's okay with you doing that. So if the user, it's a music player you said, right? So if the user has 2 GB of music, you probably don't want to download that on their 3G connection, because you're going to blow through their data limit. Wi-Fi is typically better. Most people are okay with Wi-Fi, but again, you need to consider their data limits on Wi-Fi and tune your behavior accordingly. Also, the last thing is, if you are sort of prefetching and caching, just keep in mind how large your cache is becoming. You might want to manage that. You might want to have some maximal threshold set on the app itself, so that you're not using up all of the user's capacity, storage capacity. Is there anything else you want to add on, Anirudh?
Yeah, so He also asked what API features should I consider as a developer. So if you're building a music app, the two things I would recommend are player controls from the rich notification bar, which is very handy for users, and also lock screen widget if you have your controls there, because if somebody is driving a car with a 3G card or playing with Wi-Fi, you don't want him to unlock the phone and go in and stop your music or do whatever. So the lock screen widget and notification bar controls are really good. Those are a couple of API features you should look at.
Actually, also the Bluetooth music controls.
Yeah.
So we've got APIs around that, so you can respond to buttons on people's Bluetooth headset. So when they say play, pause, next, so on.
All right. Thanks, Ankur. So the next question is, I'm trying to make an app using connectivity API. Is it communication between devices or is it between applications? What is the primary connectivity, devices or applications? What is the security layer? Is it app level or device level? So I recently gave a talk on connectivity API during DevFest Bangalore, and I think the question is sort of coming from there as a follow-up question. So I'll try to answer this. So when we say connectivity API, what we really mean is APIs like wireless APIs like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and Beam, which you could use to communicate between devices and also with the cloud like Wi-Fi. So is it communication between devices or it's between applications? So it's really communication between devices, but we've got some app level features that you could use. For example, with Wi-Fi Direct, I talked about using service discovery, which is an app level feature. So if your app is using Wi-Fi Direct to connect with another device, you can use, these are available as framework components, just like telephony manager and network connectivity manager. You have a Wi-Fi peer-to-peer manager available in your app when you extend, when you create an activity. And you could use this Wi-Fi P2P manager to discover other services around you in the Wi-Fi range. So the connection is really between the devices because it's Wi-Fi, but then your application has some extra features from the framework available on top of which you can write your applications. And the same goes for security layers. So there, if you're using Wi-Fi Direct, for example, you have options to use something from the framework, which is like a key-based authentication or to use a PIN-based authentication. These are the general wireless security options that are available to you. But on top of that, you could build something on your app as well. You could ask for PIN codes, or you could ask for user accounts, or and that same goes for Bluetooth and other connectivity APIs. So it's really that we provide core infrastructure of security and data transfer using our APIs at the device level, at the framework level. And on top of that, we give you some more flexibility in terms of what you can build. Yeah, so Ankur, would you like to add something to it?
No, I think that was quite comprehensive.
All right. Okay, the next question is, and this is from Melbourne, Jeff. I'm trying to use a search view in an action bar, and my theme is based on theme.hollow.light.dark action bar. I have an issue in which I cannot find where to set the color of the edit text in the search view. Can I use a custom layout for the search view? So I'm not really sure on the answer for this one. I think the answer is that my guess is that the attributes available on the search view are not customizable. In sense, they are not stylable attributes. So if you really need to change the color, you probably would want to grab the view from the layout during runtime. Programmatically, that is, on create, you would want to find the view with the search view ID inside your on create and try to grab a reference to the view and then modify the properties on it by exploring the layout file of the search view. So it's not simple. What I can do is I'll send a note to our UI team and see if they have any suggestions on what can be done here. But I doubt if you can customize the internals using stylable attributes. All right, let's move to the next question. Hi, I am a beginner in Android development and I need some help about getting from an URI, information from an URI, and display it in a good UI? So I think this is a very basic question and pretty broad question. So in terms of displaying it in a good UI, we have plenty of UI components available and some training classes available at developer.android.com. There are also a lot of patterns and practices which you could learn about from developers.android.com/design. We have some design guidelines on how to build a good UI, and some of those sessions we've covered in our ADL Plus show. So you could also visit our playlist and from YouTube and go back and catch up on some of those sessions. So building a good UI is kind of a broad question, and there's a lot of resources available on our developer site in YouTube and through some of these live shows. When it comes to grabbing information from a URL, what you would need is the internet permission on your application first thing, and then you could use the standard Java URL connection APIs, which would allow you to connect to a remote host, and you could set the appropriate headers or authentication scheme using URL connection, and then download the data as an HTTP response. So that's the way for doing it. And one thing to note here is that I think it was pre-Gingerbread, we recommended default HTTP client, and post-Gingerbread we recommend using URL connection because there were some issues with URL connection client before Gingerbread. So if you are building an app that's meant to be compatible across the entire range of devices, and it should be, you should consider that fact. So if you look at the during runtime, you could look at the build of the OS and then choose to use a different client to get the data. So that's default HTTP client. Ankur, any more resources you would like to point to, or?
No, just our colleague David Chandler had written a nice little library to fetch information from the net, basically passing the URL, and it just sort of abstracted a lot of the detail for you. So yeah, look up David Chandler on Google+, and he's got a really nice library that you could use.
Right, great.
I can take this one. Could you please describe the best strategy for working with fragments and loaders in a map activity? Any plans of supporting fragments in a map activity? So the honest truth is it's pretty difficult, right? You can use the map activity is something that we sort of released fairly early on. And it obviously provides the map component part of it, but it's not a traditional activity. You can't. What you need is a fragment activity from a support library if you want to use fragments. So in some ways, map activity and fragment activities are kind of divergent from one another. So I've seen developers do it with all sorts of tricks and hacks, but I also know that there's been some complications in having to do it that way. We would love to be able to just use maps in a fragment, but we as in Google haven't published anything yet. It's actually a fairly common request that we get, and so we're definitely looking into it, but we don't have anything to announce from a map fragment point of view.
So I think that was the last question.
I'll just check whether there's any other question on the on-air thread, which there doesn't seem to be. Does anyone live have any other questions before we, or should we wrap up? Is the other question.
So I think Vale Sabu from Bangalore, who asked the connectivity API question, is on the handout here. So if you have any other follow-up questions, you could ask us right now.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like it. Maybe he's shy, or maybe he just doesn't have any follow-up questions. So, on that note, I guess we'll head off. Thank you for joining us again, and we'll be back same time next week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.